Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Chapter 4. His body heavy from having woken up so early, Krishan was sitting on his haunches leaning back against one of the tall iron posts that rose from the platform. Watching the people around him with dense trance-like clarity that often takes hold when one is up before the day, when everything outside is still shrouded in the pitch-black darkness that directly precedes dawn. The train, which was scheduled for 5:15, had not yet arrived, and the platform had filled up with people, with middle-aged men, older couples, and families sitting or standing in the cool darkness of the morning, gazing out in silence as trains arrive and depart on other tracks. He was watching a family of 4 or 5 who'd stop not far from where he was sitting, standing in a circle near the edge of the platform, walking around 3 large pieces of luggage. The mother and the father were looking around the station with quiet but focused curiosity, as if they may be called upon to draw the scene from memory later on. The 3 teenage children, 2 girls and a boy, leaning on the bags with seeming indifference, lost in the dim blue glow of their phones. The parents looked like they might still live in the country, but it was obvious from their appearance of the children that the family was visiting from abroad. Their foreignness, like many diasporic children, immediately recognizable by the clothes they wore. Their tight branded shirts, tank tops, their loose tracksuits and form-fitting jeans. On another day, Krishan might have tried to speculate about the family's origins and circumstances under which they'd left, studying how the parents were dressed, whether the children spoke Tamil or the language of their adopted home. How nervous or at ease they seemed to be returning to their place of origin. Today, though, he simply gazed at them without curiosity, not in the mood to analyze or conjecture, content to give sensation precedence over thought as he sat there waiting for the train.
Anuk Arudpragasam's first novel, The Story of a Brief Marriage, was called an unflinching debut, a feat of extraordinary sensitivity and imagination, a meditation on the fundamental elements of human existence. His writing has been variously described as absolutely devastating, unbearable reading, incredibly introspective, and a portrait of the universe that zooms out from planet Earth and then back into a quark. Anuk's second novel, The Passage North, which was on the 2021 Booker Prize Shortlist, is said to be written with precision and grace, and a masterful piece that is an attempt to come to terms with life in the wake of devastation and a poignant memorial for those lost and those still alive. In this episode of BIC Talks, scientist, author, and editor of Out of Print magazine, Indira Chandrashekar, speaks to Anuk about the evolution of his writing. And now, over to Indira.
Thank you, Lekha. Hello, Anuk. What a pleasure to be speaking to you about A Passage North. Hello, everyone who's listening. I'm speaking to Anuk Arudpragasam about his wonderful book, A Passage North. Now, Anuk, you've already received much praise and accolade for it, of course, but I do want to say that it's a remarkable book. The quality of your prose, neat, uncompromisingly clean and precise, seamless, beautiful, it simply makes the layered emotional and psychological complexity of the book more intense. Now, for those of you who are listening and haven't read the book, the narrative encompasses the aftermath of the brutality of war in Sri Lanka. It's about family and the many aspects that come with caring for an aging relative, aging itself, and the consequent tragedy of autonomy, the loss of autonomy, rather, the relationship with caregivers, tragedy, love, desire, the meaning of relationship, and yearning. Yes, yearning. And towards the end of the book, Anuk, you have a beautiful analysis or perhaps a reflection on the difference between yearning and desire, which really is rather special. Now, I'm going to keep speaking for just a second longer because I do want to read out the wonderful testament from Colm Toibin about the book, because I think it somehow summarizes the wonder of the book, and those of you who don't have it can go out and buy it. Written with scrupulous attention to nuance and detail, A Passage North captures the rich interior of its protagonist's mind, but also contemporary Sri Lanka itself, war-scarred, traumatized. At its center is an exquisite form of noticing, a way of rendering consciousness and handling time that connects Arudpragasam to the great novelists of the past. What a wonderful praise. What wonderful words of praise. Though I'm curious, Anuk, which novelists of the past do you think he's connecting you to?
Thank you for those lovely words, Indira.
Yes. May I ask you to begin by reading from the first couple of pages of the book? Would that be all right?
The present, we assume, is eternally before us, one of the few things in life from which we cannot be parted. It overwhelms us in the painful first moments of entry into the world, when it is still too new to be managed or negotiated. Remains by our side during childhood and adolescence, and those years before the weight of memory and expectation. And so it is sad and a little unsettling to see that we become, as we grow older, much less capable of touching, grazing, or even glimpsing it. The closest we seem to get to the present are those brief moments we stop to consider the spaces our bodies are occupying. The intimate warmth of the sheets in which we wake, the scratched surface of the window on a train taking us somewhere else, as if the only way we can hold time still is by trying physically to prevent the objects around us from moving. The present, we realize, eludes us more and more as the years go by, showing itself for fleeting moments before losing us in the world's incessant movement, fleeing the second we look away and leaving scarcely a trace of its passing. Or this, at least, is how it usually seems in retrospect. Or this, at least, is how it usually seems in retrospect, when in the next brief moment of consciousness, the next occasion we are able to hold things still, we realize how much time has passed since we were last aware of ourselves, when we realize how many days, weeks, and months have slipped by without our consent. Events take place, moods ebb and flow, people and situations come and go, but looking back during these rare junctures in which we are, for whatever reason, lifted up from the circular daydream of everyday life, we are slightly surprised to find ourselves in the places we are, as though we were absent while everything was happening, as though we were somewhere else during the time that is usually referred to as our life. Waking up each morning, we follow by circuitous routes the thread of habit, out of our homes, into the world, and back to our beds at night, move unseeingly through familiar paths, one day giving way to another, and 1 week to the next, so that when in the midst of this daydream something happens and the thread is finally cut, when, in a moment of strong desire or unexpected loss, the rhythms of life are interrupted, we look around and are quietly surprised to see that the world is vaster than we thought, as if we'd been tricked or cheated out of all that time that in retrospect appears to have contained nothing of substance, no change and no duration, time that has come and gone but left us somehow untouched.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful reading and that beautiful text. A few pages down, later from this reading, the protagonist reflects. I should interject to say that the protagonist, Krishan, receives news of the death of the caregiver, Rani. And he reflects that paradoxically, the death has led for him not to think about Rani but himself, and to look at himself from the outside and to see from a distance the life in which he had been immersed. And I think that's very much somehow central to the book, this idea of this immersion. But I'm going to continue for just a second and ask you a question, because I know that earlier when we had spoken, we talked about the many layers in this book, the many strands in this book. The strand, of course, of the war, but also of family, of relationships, of the complexity of the book. And I was curious, and I had asked you about the structure of the book and the process of creation and the process of structuring the book. And I think we both came to the conclusion that one way to enter this discussion about the process of creation is through the fantastic story of Pusal. And so, would you tell us, Anuk, about Pusal?
Well, the story of Pusal comes from an anthology of poems, hagiography, technically speaking, written, I'm not sure when exactly, the 12th, 13th or 14th centuries in Tamil by a famous poet called Sekular. And the story of Pusal is one of many poems about different Saivite saints in this text. They're all poems of devotion, and Pusal's story is the story of a devotee of Shiva, a poor man who for many years wonders how he can best demonstrate his affection and his devotion to his Lord. He decides, after a lot of thinking, one day that he will build, in fact, a temple in honor of Shiva. And he goes about trying to find land and resources, and very quickly comes up against his poverty, the fact that he doesn't know the right people, he doesn't have the resources to build this temple. And this realization sets off a period of depression in him. He is inconsolable that he cannot honor God in the way that he wants. Until one day he realizes that actually he can build a temple, it just needs to be imaginary, it just needs to be in his mind. And so what he does, and I think this is for me the most beautiful part of the poem, is that he begins in his mind to find a plot of land, to find carpenters, masons, painters, to acquire materials of different kinds, stone, plaster, wood, everything that is required to build the temple. And then according to the various ritual prescriptions, he lays down the foundation stone in his mind in this plot of land that he has found. And then he begins by himself, slowly over a period of, it's not specified in the poem, but I imagine many years, to construct this temple brick by brick in his mind until it is finally as a result of great mental effort, constructed. And so the way the poem goes is that Pusal sets a day for the inauguration of the temple, for a time and a day for Shiva to be installed into the temple. And it turns out that on that exact same day is also set the consecration of a physical temple, of a grand physical temple that is being built by the Lord of the realm. This, in fact, refers to a historical temple, Chidambaram. I don't know if you've actually seen it, but it's a striking and it's a beautiful temple. And so what happens is that the night before the consecration of this physical temple, Shiva enters the dreams of the king and informs him that unfortunately he won't be able to attend the consecration because he has to attend the consecration of a even grander temple built by one famous devotee, Pusalar. And the king wakes up, he's shocked, indignant that someone might have built a temple grander than the one he has built. He gets his retinue, he locates the distant village that Pusal lives in, and he asks the people there, where is Pusal and where's the temple that he's built? I need to see it. And the men tell him, well, we know who Pusal is, but he hasn't built any temple. You can show him if you want. And he says yes, and they take him to meet Pusal, and they find a man sitting cross-legged, emaciated, in front of his home, eyes closed, a blissful face. And as soon as the king calls out to him, Pusal opens his eyes. He recognizes the regal voice, and he explains about the temple and how he's built it meticulously, attentively, with love in his mind. And the poem ends with the king shocked by this man's devotion, and the king gets on his knees, and his fragrant garlands mingle with the dirt as the poem ends. And what I love about, well, I love so many things about this poem, but I love here that also imagination and imaginary work, imaginary labor, mental labor is specified so concretely that it's not a how do I say, wishy-washy process, or it's not a matter of flights of fancy or of the arbitrary introduction of different elements. No, it's very systematic, it's very meticulous. It involves dedicated work over a long period of time, and somehow the concreteness, I think, which is attached to what we usually think of as acts that are quite unspecifiable, I think really helps give some kind of real content to this idea of the work of the mind, or the work of imagination. But as we talked about in our conversation yesterday, there's really so many ways that this poem can be read.
It is really a remarkable poem, and I don't think I've really come across anything similar, as far as I know, of something remaining completely in the imagination like that. Because in the story of Shabari, for example, where she expects the Lord will come, and then she creates this idea of wanting to be devoted to him, she still gives him the fruit when Rama arrives, you see. This is entirely in the mind. It's quite extraordinary.
Specifically this fact that a non-concrete structure, a structure that is purely of the mind, of the imagination, ultimately receives... the story is in a way a story about recognition and structures of recognition and what gets recognized. There is a structure built by the state, by the king, at massive expense. One imagines also a massive human cost. And then there's this private, intimate mental structure. And precisely because it is not visible, precisely because it does not take up space in the real world, it is not recognized. The king does not know about it. Even the villages near Pusul do not know about it. However, Siva knows about it. And it's given this kind of divine recognition that privileges, in a way, the world of the invisible.
Now, I know you studied philosophy at Columbia, and since my son studied philosophy at Chicago, political philosophy in his case, I was curious and I looked up what you worked on, and I came upon your thesis abstract. And I certainly did not read more beyond the abstract, but I found that you looked at the ethical thought of the American philosophers William James and John Dewey. Now, I'm going to quote from your abstract, open quotes. Dewey's most important work in ethics is located in his rich and sophisticated theory of habit, where he reworks the Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics to emphasize the contingency of our habitual systems and the importance of the ideal of growth. Now, I was very taken with that because I did note while I was reading your wonderful book that you very often come to this idea of, the daily habit, the habit of the thread of habit, the familiar parts, the circular daydream of everyday life, the routines and rhythms, and then you speak about lifting from those circular daydreams and the interruptions of the rhythms of life. Now, tell me, how much do you think this your study in philosophy somehow influenced this, or was this?
No, I think there is definitely a strong connection. I don't know if one influenced the other so much as my interest in a certain set of topics led me in both of these areas of writing to think about habit and the habitual. In philosophy in particular, there's a tendency to think in terms of decision making, in terms of cognitive processes in terms of, we hold somebody responsible in ethics for what they have done, insofar as what they have done is an expression of a certain kind of intention, the result of a certain kind of conscious, deliberative process. And thinking of questions of ethical life, questions of how do we live, how do we organize our time and our relationships with others, thinking of those in terms of purely conscious practices of deliberation, basically conceals from our view huge swaths of human life, huge swaths of our life, in which how we operate is habitual, is not thought of, is accumulated or created in various ways, and then shed and dissolved also in equally unconscious ways. I've been interested in habit because I'm interested in the daily, the everyday. As one studies philosophy more and more, I began studying philosophy because of this kind of youthful feeling, I suppose, that it is possible to transcend the daily or to be liberated from everydayness. I thought this transcendence could happen through philosophy. And the longer one studies philosophy, of course, the longer one realizes, the longer one lives, I believe, the longer one realizes, the more one realizes that such liberation is not possible. And so my focus, I think, over the years in philosophy moved to actually everydayness and the ways in which the relationship to everydayness can be changed, in which our everyday lives can be enriched. And so I began to think about habit. One thing that Dewey talks a lot about, John Dewey, the early 20th century American philosopher, is the way in which when our lives become determined by habit, we can move through the world without really needing to pay attention to it. There are certain, I can get up in the morning and I can find myself then 2 or 3 hours later sitting at my desk at work, and actually I might not have noticed anything between the moment of waking up and the moment of sitting at my desk, because the environments I pass through, the objects I handle, the routes I take are all habitual. I don't need to quite see it. And so Hegel talks about habit as a great liberator, because it liberates the mind so that it can reflect on other things other than the banal. Habit takes care of our movement through the world. But for Dewey, it's also something that prevents us from perception, that stops us from seeing. He uses the example of a doorknob on a door that one uses every day, and how if one day the doorknob was to stop working, if the door was to get jammed, that would be the day actually that one stops and notices the doorknob for the first time. Until that time, if somebody was to ask you, what does that doorknob in that door that you use every day look like, you might not have been able to say. So when there is an interruption to a system of habit, when one of the elements that are required to be stable for a habitual system to unfold is distorted or interrupted, then one looks, one sees. And so I think with my writing in general, I try to find moments in which our habitual relationship to the world is distorted in some way, and in which a certain kind of perception one is compelled into looking.
Very interesting. That's fascinating. And as you were talking, I was thinking of an elderly grandaunt I had, and women from that generation, often very bright, led very constrained lives. Although she was she had a relatively easy life, I should say. But however, you don't have places to express yourself. And if you asked her, how are you? She would say, well, I got up in the morning and I brushed my teeth. And then she would recount everything she did. She picked up the comb, she combed her hair, and she would recount every single action of the day. And we always laughed about it. But I see now that perhaps it was a way to hang on to some kind of reality,
Yeah. This is also, I guess, part of the theme or the subject of these first pages that I read out. This idea that when you don't pay attention, life slips away. Yes. There's a kind of that to pay attention is the way to stop, is the way to hold time still. That paying attention is also a way of of staying in the world, of keeping it close somehow.
Well, continuing with the whole sort of strand of philosophy, and with John Dewey, you immediately are the phrase that comes to mind is lived experience, right? And without getting into that, I do see that this book, so much of this book is about the protagonist coming to terms with or dealing with the war and his own life of relative privilege that separated him from the brutality and the tragedy of the war, and of confronting, and the fact that he confronts that brutality and tragedy in your novel through the visual, by consuming documentaries and documentation. And I really appreciate the way that you've used the visual, the eye, the retina, you bring in Kuttimani, and then also the retina as a place of imprinting the brutality, and the idea of the archived, imagined vision. And an imagined transfer of that idea to Rani and the images that one presumes she cannot escape. And so would you like to talk a little bit about that?
It's a very interesting thing to think about for me, because, well, this is my second book, and my first book, they're both dealing in a way with similar subject, the end of the war in Sri Lanka, 2008-2009, and the genocide that took place against the Tamil community at that time. But my first novel attempted, from a place of ignorance, of course, to project a consciousness into that situation of violence and horror. And I noticed that after reading it, of course, actually after having a reader tell me this, that book was all about sound. Somebody used this expression, these soundscapes, or the way, the functioning of the sonic in that text. And I realized very much as I was writing this book, how much more the visual came to the fore, how much more the eyes rather than the ears were centered. And between writing these two books, I was also a teacher during my PhD, and one of the books I taught in my time was Dante's Inferno. And I don't know if you remember from reading that book, but whenever the character Dante enters a new level of hell, he doesn't actually see anything. He hears. And the reason the author does that, I believe, is that when you hear something that you cannot see, there's a sense of disorientation. Usually, because the range of sight is much greater than the range of hearing, we see things approaching before we can hear them approaching. And so we are ready, when we hear them, we are ready to hear them. We know they're approaching. When we hear something first, it means it has approached us without our knowing. Which is why often if somebody touches you or says something to your ear from behind when you're not ready for it, there's a shock. And so what Dante does by having his character hear first is put him and the reader in this state of disorientation. This disorientation that belongs to every new level of hell that he enters. And I think, and I've been thinking of this difference between, I guess, the sonic and the visual in these two texts in these terms. Namely, so the first novel was set in this situation of great violence where shells are falling, and so where you hear always first before you see. Whereas this novel is not a novel of the experience of the direct or immediate or first-hand experience of war. Rather, it's a novel about the diasporic experience of war. It's a novel about what it means to be forced to spectate, to witness such violence on your community and not be able to act. And so, in this novel, the visual, oftentimes removed from the sonic, removed from hearing, is really what's privileged. Also, because often when we see, the things we see are far enough away that we're unable to interact with them. There's a certain lack of agency in our vision often. That is not quite the case. I mean, it's complicated because obviously we can choose what we look at or where to direct the gaze in a way we cannot quite direct our hearing. But nevertheless, when it comes to looking into distant objects, which is very often the kind of looking that is taking place in this book, there's a certain kind of passivity. There's a certain kind of you can do nothing but look.
Especially since your protagonist is not located in Sri Lanka at the time of the war, or much of the time of the war, and at least certainly at the end of the war he's in Delhi. That idea, that sense of removal and the sense of viewing through intervening media is also sort of plays into this. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because Krishan, maybe almost half of our population lives abroad, right? Or lives outside the island.
Fascinating. I mean, I also very much was intrigued by the fact that, the protagonist, Krishna, is obviously feeling and states that he has this guilt about not having participated. Participated is not even having been there. You cannot participate if you were not there. And so his privilege took him away from that. And then somehow assuaging or at least recognizing that beauty is another. So therefore he travels north to the Tamil area. And then it's not only guilt but beauty. That was very... which drew him to this place. That was very beautiful, actually. And your descriptions of landscape are very... they're very beautiful because they are not sentimental. Their profound observation of the space and of sensitivity, but they don't have that kind of nostalgia. They're just recognition of the beauty, both of land and seascape, really. I love the way you spoke about addiction, and it comes into play when he lights a cigarette, really, and talks about his, smoking less, smoking more with his lover, not smoking when he's back at home with his mother and grandmother, and then starting to smoke again. And through all of that, he speaks about his addiction, and there are two sort of rather evocative scenes of his smoking on a train, in the last carriage of the train, and watching the landscape. But in both of those scenes, he turns away from whoever might possibly be looking at him when he lights the cigarette. I was very curious as to why he doesn't want to reveal he was smoking.
Oh, you mean on the train?
On the train.
Well, I've gotten in trouble myself for smoking on a train.
Is that right?
Yes, so you're not supposed to. I mean, I don't think you're supposed to.
Oh, I
don't think you're supposed to smoke on a train.
Oh, I guess in my day on trains there was not much of a...
It was not much of an issue, huh?
Issue,
yeah.
Yes.
Well, also I think specifically I think it's more of an issue in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka there's a disciplinarian streak running through Sri Lankan society, I think, that is not present in India in the same way.
Well, we could do with a little bit of discipline, perhaps. Yes, well, since you said India, I loved your line about India, an endless country that he'd always associated with the beginning and end of human time. It's rather beautiful, really.
Yeah, well...
Yeah.
One parallel between the narrator in this case and the author is a certain kind of sense of India. I mean, when you come from a small country like Sri Lanka, there's a certain feeling of entrapment, and there's a certain small-mindedness that comes with the smallness. This sense that it's possible to believe that the way you do things is the only way to do things, because you're not confronted with other ways of doing things. And I think that's an experience that's impossible to have here. One is always confronted with the fact that any particular thing can be done in multifarious different ways, and that your way of doing things is just one way of doing things. I mean, in a way that maybe perhaps compels people to follow more dogmatically the things that they arbitrarily happen to, or for historical reasons happen to follow, maybe not. But I always had that sense of this is a place where so many different kinds of life are possible and can coexist. I've always been very moved by that.
Oh, that's nice to know, and I hope we're able to sustain that as we try to move towards a sort of a mono line of
Monoculture, yeah.
Yes. But I think I mentioned this already, but I do have to point out that one of this what I call the geographic schism I faced when I was reading your novel, which is when you speak about going into the Tamil area, to the Tamil country. You're moving north, whereas in India, when you're moving into the Tamil Nadu or towards Sri Lanka, you're moving south. And so, as I said to you, rationally, of course, I knew that and I was fine. But at moments when I was deeply immersed in the text and suddenly you're speaking about moving in the wrong direction, I was so disoriented. And I remembered a novel by a European writer whom unfortunately I can't remember, that I read many years ago about a young man who returns to his country and or to his village rather, and at that moment he's completely disoriented. It's been many years, but the stream is moving in the wrong direction than that which he remembered, and he doesn't know what's happened. He's, that's sort of the beginning of the novel. So so it was like that for me.
It's interesting that you mentioned this. Of course, it wasn't something that I was exactly aware of as I was writing, because to me, of course, the Tamil area, I've grown up with this idea of Tamil area being north, but it does raise a series of questions. I mean, northernness and southernness. One often says deep south, right? In Sri Lanka, we use the expression deep south to refer to the low-lying Sinhalese areas, like right at the southern coast. One never says deep north, though. One sometimes uses the northern reaches, maybe the up north, but it's interesting, the language itself, I believe, gives north and south, the English language that we're speaking in gives various valences to these cardinalities, but it's also played with, I think, a little bit in the novel. There's of course, along with the Pusal story, is the story of the cloud messenger, Meghadut, and which is, of course, a story about a cloud carrying a message from one separated lover to another, from central India, from the plains of central India, all the way up to the Himalayas. So, and the poem is, part of its beauty is the fact that it turns into a kind of travelogue, into a kind of geographical and cultural description of the subcontinent from south to north, which is the direction, of course, that the monsoon takes, and therefore the direction that the cloud takes. For example, this story is recalled by Krishan when he's on a train traveling from south to north, but really from the south of Sri Lanka to the north of Sri Lanka, right? And so the directionality is totally changed. And that's something I try to do with a lot of the old literature that was incorporated into the text, to put them in slightly different contexts than they are usually presented in, and to see how those contexts would charge these stories differently from our usual readings.
It certainly made me sit up, and then the Meghaduta. Well, first of all, your retelling or your sort of encapsulation of the Meghaduta is very, very beautifully written, and the way you close the whole idea of the cloud is deeply moving. So thank you.
The idea
of
the cloud disappearing, right?
Yes,
which doesn't come up in the text, I don't believe, right?
No, but but one knows that
right.
already from the sort of transient nature of a cloud.
Yes, of course, yes.
Yes.
It's amazing that the cloud has maintained its solidity until the end of the of the lovers' discourse.
Yes. Your descriptions of love are also very, very beautiful. But I lived in Bombay for a while, and so there was this This bit where you are in Bombay, it's a very pivotal moment, sort of in the relationship and the, shall I call it, the love affair, the relationship between Krishan and his lover Anjum. Yes, and I think that the description that you have of Bombay there is really very, it's just a line, but I thought it was so brilliant actually. And I wondered if you'd like to read just a little segment. And let me tell you from where.
I'm very pleasantly surprised that you say this, because I spent all of 5 days, I think, in Mumbai, so I know the city. I know the city very, very poorly.
No, but it was actually just what you captured of that impression of the city, you see. So, and it's also about them. So, if you could sort of start where it says it was dark now, somewhere around there. Otherwise, we go on too long.
And you can just tell me when to stop.
Maybe at the end of the chapter. It's very soon thereafter.
It was dark now, the pavement lit by the sodium glow of the tall street lamps on the road to their right, and stretching out to their left, the water glimmered in the warm night, the city's reflected intensities fluctuating on its surface. To their right, curving outward with the coastline into the distance ahead, high-rises rose up to form the skyline, the first of endless lines of buildings that comprised the island of Bombay. Buildings that contained within their small compartments tens of millions of suffering and striving people from all across the country, a condensation of human life so dense and so rich that it was impossible to believe such a place existed till one saw it with one's own eyes. It was as though, as they walked together holding hands that night, they were being presented with a crystallization of two contradictory possibilities of liberation that existence on earth offered. The possibility, on the one hand, that one felt whenever one came across an immense number of people living in a single place, the possibility of finding among all those millions a person or people with whom one could be happy. And the possibility, on the other, that was felt whenever one looked into the endless, lightless reaches of the night sea, the possibility of liberation that was associated with oblivion, with the cutting of ties and voyaging out into the unknown. Krishan held Anjum's hand a little more tightly, and looking at her as she looked back at him, her tall, graceful form silhouetted by the silver-yellow halo of the city behind her, she appeared to him just as she'd appeared the first day they'd met, just as she'd appeared that night on the train with the countryside rushing past behind her, with that combination of sadness, longing, and conviction that he'd felt with certainty that moment, never forget. He continued gazing at her, the severity of her profile and the vulnerability of her gaze, and it was as though he could feel the sight of her penetrating his eyes in real time, burning itself delicately into the film of his retinas, forming an image that would remain imprinted in the back of his eyes like a shadow or like tracing paper over everything he saw subsequently. And maybe this was this reason it had occurred to him at that moment that eyesight weakened with the passing of the years, not because of old age or disease, not because of the deterioration of the cornea or the lenses or the finely tuned muscles that control them, but because, rather, of the accumulation of a few such images over the course of one's brief sojourn on earth. Images of great beauty that pierced the eyes and superimposed themselves over everything one saw afterward, making it harder over time to see and pay attention to the outside world. Though perhaps it occurred to him now, 4 years later, in the country of his birth, walking at the back of the procession bearing Rani's body for cremation, Rani who'd seen so much that she had never been able to forget. Perhaps he'd been naive back then. Perhaps it was not just images of beauty that clouded one's vision over time, but images of violence too. Those moments of violence that for some people were just as much a part of life as the moments of beauty. Both kinds of image appearing when we least expected it, and both continuing to haunt us thereafter, both of which marked and branded us, limiting how far we were subsequently able to see.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that really gives a sense of multiple aspects of the novel.
Yeah, it does, yeah. I never read that passage, but it's a good one to read.
It's beautiful, beautiful passage. Well, then I'll close with a reference to another train novel, if you will, which is Christopher Isherwood's Mr. Norris Changes Trains, which is set in Nazi Berlin. And Isherwood denounced it later. It's set in Nazi Berlin, and it's about the nightlife in Berlin, and it's the one, it's one of the ones from which Cabaret was made, the film. I think it was Berlin Stories, which Cabaret was made from, but it's part of the same set of two novels. And Isherwood denounced it later in life, saying, "What repels me now about Mr. Norris is its heartlessness. The only genuine monster was the young foreigner." And I interject, I think the young foreigner, it's a semi-autobiographical kind of novel, and the young foreigner is himself. The young foreigner who passed gaily through these scenes of desolation, misinterpreting them to suit his childish fantasy. And I think you've transcended that pitfall, certainly. I think if you look back on this book, on your novel many years later, you can be proud of this experiment, this analysis, this exploration of attempting at documenting and reconciling this time that you wrote about.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Saranaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.